Have you ever made up stories about your toys? This is a story about some toys that were bought in America and what happened when their owner found them again years later in her mother's attic in London. They wrote a famous book about them, which has, at its heart, a message of overcoming first impressions and making friends with someone who is very different to you. In Britain, the American Minstrel Doll was metamorphosed into the magical Golliwog, which not only broke down racial stereotypes, but became a beacon for tolerance and our multicultural society. This book, The Adventures of Two Dutch Dolls, was written in 1895 by Bertha Upton and illustrated by her daughter Florence. It is about some of the toys that Florence owned as a little girl, but the story was written when she was a grown-up to help her pay her way through art college. At the same time, in the United States, a series of segregation laws, the so-called Jim Crow laws, were being enacted to make sure that people of different skin colours would live separate lives. Yet, here on the front cover, the black character is hand in hand with the white ones. From the very start, the Golliwog was breaking down barriers. Although Bertha and Florence were English, the story is set in a New York toy shop, and it is a classic toys come to life on Christmas Eve story. For many years, the original toys were displayed at the V&A Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green. The first toys that come to life are the Dutch dolls of the title, and the first thing they do is to find an American flag with which to make themselves some clothes, an action that in America is probably treasonable. They get up to all sorts of antics, until from out of nowhere appears the Golliwog. As far as anyone knows, Golliwog was their own made-up name. He is described as the blackest gnome, so in the story he is identified as one of the fairy folk. The fairy folk were to Victorians what aliens from Mars are to children now, an entity totally different from anything you had ever come across before. With his oversized head and long hair, the Golliwog looked just as outlandish to the Victorians. To British eyes, he was dressed like a fashionable Victorian gentleman of the time. He looked like Charles Dickens. Initially, the extraordinary Golliwog scares the living daylights out of the two Dutch dolls. But by the next page, they are trying to chat him up. This is very much a story about accepting and befriending someone who is totally different from you. In the toy shop, even more toys come to life, as the story builds towards the grand ball for Christmas Eve. Of particular interest are the pictures of the African costume doll, who goes against Jim Crow etiquette by dancing with Sarah Jane, and of the American Minstrel Doll, who, with his banjo, is providing the music for the dance, because unlike these dolls, Golliwog is of the fairy folk and is not meant to be human. If you see a figure that you think is meant to be human, then it isn't a Golliwog. The friends are getting tired of the dance and decide to make their escape from the toy shop. They go off sledging and sliding and have a snowball fight. You just know that the whole thing will end in total disaster, and the story ends with the most bedraggled Golliwog you ever saw. It was the black Golliwog rather than the wooden dolls that caught the public imagination, and at the turn of the last century, Bertha and Florence wrote a dozen books about the adventurous Golliwog. He explored the world by bike and airship, and got to the North Pole 8 years before any human rival. In 1901, he even built his own electric car, powered by battery, a feat that every car maker on the planet is now trying to emulate. When the friends set off on their road trip, they are held up by a highwayman who insults the Golliwog by calling him a wandering minstrel dog. His detractors persist in saying that Golliwog is the same as the American Minstrel Doll, who is an imbecilic figure of fun. But as we have seen, Golliwog is of the fairy folk, friendly, inventive, kind, brave, and posh, but very accident prone. To modern readers, the books aren't always politically correct in their dealings with characters from other countries, but at no point is it suggested that the Golliwog himself is human. Golliwogs soon appeared as toys. The later teddy bears were factory-made toys for middle-class children, but a Golliwog ragdoll was easily knitted or made from scraps of fabric at home. As an adventurous spirit, he was an acceptable doll for small boys, one of the few without a military connotation. However, I have seen a letter from a World War I British soldier who, in a letter home, thanked his family for sending him a lucky Golliwog. By the 1920s, the Golliwog in Britain had come to represent good, wholesome childhood, in the same way as teddy bears do now. Those children no more associated their toy Golliwogs with slavery than today's children associate their favourite teddy bears with blood sports. This was reflected in all sorts of advertising. Germaline depicted him empathising when you had hurt yourself, whilst Ovaltine and Oxo showed him as the toy you tucked to bed with you. However, it was Robertsons who will be forever associated with Golly. For 3 tokens off their jars, children could send away for a high-quality enamel Golly brooch. Over 20 million was sent out over 70 years, with special editions raising money for a variety of good causes. It was probably the longest and best-loved loyalty scheme in British retailing. His detractors continue to claim that Golliwogs are a crude, negative racial stereotype, but the aspirational characters shown on the brooches include a judge, firefighter, lifeboat crew and bagpiper. All were positive role models. Making palpably false claims about the Golliwog's character really matters, because it has caused an unwarranted sense of victimhood and grievance. However, there was one group of people who really didn't like Golliwogs. In 1934, just a year after coming into power, the Nazi Party had banned all Golliwogs and black dolls in Germany, the only government ever to do so. The children's newspaper clearly saw this banishment as an omen of what was to come.
But now that he is banned by the Nazis, Mr. Golliwog acquires a fresh importance. He is almost a martyr.
The London Evening Standard reported in 1936,
German children this year will not be allowed black dolls or Golliwogs.
A Nazi spokesman said the reason being that Aryan children might come to love them and think blacks were their equals. Of course, the Nazis had a point because that is exactly what had been happening in Britain. By the time the Americans joined World War II, 2 generations of British children had grown up with the Golliwog books, and the picture of the African doll and the magical Golliwog enjoying the dance together was familiar to everyone. In contrast, the Americans had had 2 generations growing up under the so-called Jim Crow segregation laws, so white American soldiers were astonished to find that English women not only enjoyed dancing with black GIs, but were proud to have them as steady boyfriends. In Britain, the minstrel doll in his new guise as the Golliwog had helped to turn racism on its head. In Britain, our children were having a tough time. Millions had been evacuated, sweets were rationed, and toy shops were empty because the toy factories were now making things more useful to the war effort. Every Christmas and every birthday, parents wondered what on earth they could give their children as a present. Everything was in short supply, apart from the blackout fabric used to make heavy curtains to avoid homes being seen by the enemy aircraft. Most English children had a homemade Golly, and with his familiar friendly face, he gave them comfort in troubled times. Often they were crudely made, but frequently these toys were loved to bits. In her mass observation diary, Nella Last recorded how she made dozens of Golliwogs. Many were given to her local hospital. Telling the wartime generation of children that Golliwogs are racist is as culturally crass as telling the recent COVID generation that by displaying teddy bears in the window, it showed their tacit support of blood sports. One customer of the Ginger Pop shop told us how she was evacuated to live with her grandparents in the countryside. She had very few toys, so her grandmother made her a Golliwog from scraps of fabric, but his black hair was made from the fur of the rabbit they had eaten for dinner. Over the years, many authors have written stories about Golliwogs. Enid Blyton was born just 2 years after the first book came out, and they would have been her childhood reading. When she became an author herself, her stories for very young children often had a moral twist, with toys in the nursery acting out the roles, good and bad. The Three Golliwogs was a wartime story about identical triplets who are clever, kind, and have lots of friends. One name in particular is now fetishised, which would seem very odd to a generation who studied Latin at school. The song they sing is one of the few incidences where I think a change to Enid Blyton's original text is warranted. The Golliwog Who Smoked is probably Enid Blyton's least PC story title, and is particularly popular with adults. Stories such as The White Golliwog showed children how upsetting it is to be bullied, and that a person's character cannot be judged by their skin colour. This is a copy of the first letter sent by the Dutch illustrator Harmsen van der Beek to Enid Blyton. Noddy and his friends are shown here for the very first time. And who is the special one who was chosen to give her the flowers? Yet a problem arose because Enid Blyton had made her Golliwogs both good and bad characters, which wasn't acceptable to those who thought that black characters should only be depicted as being good. Of course, Gollies usually are good, so to have a gang of bad uns appear in Noddy Book 4, Here Comes Noddy Again, who then stole Noddy's car, was doubly shocking to young readers. It was a clever twist in the tale by a master storyteller. Enid Blyton's critics have made some truly bizarre claims, which are then repeated by lazy journalists, who also don't trouble themselves to read the books. In a Radio 4 programme, biographer Nadia Cohen said, "The Golliwogs were always villains and criminals. They had to be washed or spanked before they could become acceptable." A correspondent to The Guardian claimed that Enid Blyton's Gollies were savage and regularly bit people, whilst a Guardian journalist had the temerity to call them Jim Crow dolls. Even the collections officer of the V&A Museum of Childhood described the Golly in the Noddy books as the bad lad of Toy Town. They forget that amongst the good was Mr. Golly, the garage owner, who was the most successful businessman in Toyland and who had given Noddy his car in the first place. Professor David Rudd counted all the Gollies and Teddies in the Noddy books as part of his PhD, and assures us that there are far more bad Teddies than Gollies in the Noddy books. In the early 1990s, someone who had mistakenly thought that Golliwogs were unpleasant caricatures of black people decided to replace them in the Noddy books, often with monkeys, presumably because they thought that monkeys were better than black people. This was political correctness gone mad, because something that wasn't racist had been replaced by something that most certainly was. Enid Blyton's books would be further bowdlerised, with the good Gollies in the Wishing Chair stories being replaced by a teddy, and in the Amelia Jane stories by Action Man. This little boy dressed up as a Golliwog, his favourite book character in 1950. The first major toy fair in Britain was held in Brighton in 1954, and this poster shows that just one toy was chosen to represent the entire British toy industry. This immigrant had done well. In a little under 60 years, the Golliwog had become possibly the best-loved toy in Britain and was popular throughout the Commonwealth. The Ginger Pop shop has sold Golliwogs to adults from around the world. There were the West Indian grannies on a day trip from London who giggled like schoolgirls as they chose their Golly keyrings, and the lady who chose the most expensive ones in the window, in memory of Gollies her West Indian mother had bought her when she was a little girl. People from Africa didn't understand what the fuss was about, but were pleased to find a black-faced toy. "It's a black doll loved by white children, and so I have no problem with the Golliwog," said a Nigerian. One grandmother from Hampshire sold thousands of Gollies at village fetes to raise money for educational projects in her native Ghana. In the 1970s, the Golliwog returned to a life of high adventure, taking to both the sea and air, and becoming something of a national hero. Our top yachtswoman of the time was Claire Francis, and she persuaded her former employer to sponsor her boat. When she knocked 3 days off the women's world record for sailing the Atlantic single-handedly, her yacht, Robertson's Golly, had pride of place at the London Boat Show. The World Ballooning Championships were held at Castle Howard in 1977. Robertsons had sponsored the event, so their balloons were chosen to go on the front cover of the official programme. It was the first appearance of Golly 3, Britain's first fancy-shaped hot air balloon. Chaka Artwell doesn't like other people telling him what is or isn't racist, and during a BBC discussion, Professor of Black Studies Kehinde Andrews was rendered speechless when he discovered that not all black people thought the same about Golliwogs as he did. Artwell explained that the Golliwog ban in Britain started with the Greater London Council in 1983, even though it wasn't an issue for Afro-Caribbean people at the time. He believes that the ban was actually a distraction from the real problems his community faced, such as the sus laws, mental health, and educational issues. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and to his proud owner, this Golliwog is beautiful. During a spot of bother at the ginger pop shop, a customer who also happened to be a distinguished judge in the West Indies wrote a letter of support for us. Dear nice policeman, please take our black views into account. We are not offended by gollywogs, we are offended by too much political correctness, where people walk on eggshells in discussion on race. Let's be frank, we are different. Let us love and respect difference, even as represented by the Golliwog. Sadly, there are people out there who, for their own reasons, only feel happy when they make other people's life a misery. Gollywogs, coconuts and marmalade are all good things with which bullies have taunted their victims. Yet it is nonsensical to ban any of them, because to do so is to tacitly agree that the bully has made a valid point, so their warped worldview prevails. For this reason, we should also dignify him with his full name of Golliwog, which was totally made up and predates the racist slur of wog. If you want to take small rude words out of longer ordinary words, would you ask football fans to take the arse out of Arsenal? And whatever would become of this pretty little Dorset hamlet? All sorts of customers of the ginger pop shop have acquired the nickname Golly. For some, it was because the way that their hair grew. Some were called Robertson, and one had grandchildren who couldn't pronounce granny. None of these people thought the name derogatory. All of these people were white. Black people who were bullied have very good reason to loathe gollywogs, but that is not a sufficient reason to ban them. When a racist throws a banana at a footballer, no one calls for the banning of bananas. There has probably been racism for as long as there have been races. Fetishizing words or banning toys are simplistic solutions to a deep-set problem, because racists will utilize anything and everything to be horrible. Society would be forever playing catch-up, banning more and more, including seminal books. Like bananas, gollywogs are not de facto hateful objects, because context is everything. In 2016, market research on unacceptable insults rated Nazi as mild and Golliwog as off the scale. Yet during the war, the real Nazis had murdered people by the million and had banned gollywogs in their drive for racial purity. How had it come to this, that the toy who had embodied the fight against fascism was now so vilified? Had the British public finally lost the plot? There is a fine line where good-natured banter becomes spiteful bullying. Some people watching this video are bullies. Please, go and sort out your own issues, because you have no right to spoil your victims' lives. And keep our Golliwog out of it. He is about tolerance, not hateful racism. At the start of 2015, journalists were murdered for publishing cartoons that some other people found offensive. Millions of people took to the streets to assert their right to freedom of speech and the principle that no one has the right not to be offended. This film has been made to show that no one needs to be offended by the Golliwog. However, if it proves impossible to restore the reputation of a ragdoll after decades of defamation of character, what hope for any hapless human who also finds themselves to be cancelled? Golliwogs are a force for good, and we can be proud that here in Britain we have them within our multicultural tradition. To buy Golliwog books, dolls and other goodies, please visit gingerpop.co.uk.